You think you know what happens when a girl is sold to a monster. You expect tears, ripped silk, and a cold iron cage. But when 19-year-old Florence stood trembling before the blood-soaked Alpha King of the North, his very first command didn't just shatter her expectations, it ignited a war. The great hall of House Ashdown smelled of old wine, damp stone, and desperation. Florence stood in the shadows of the arched pillars, the heavy velvet of her emerald gown pulling at her shoulders like a shroud. She was 19, a human noblewoman in a world where humans only held power as long as the werewolf packs allowed it. Her father, Lord Reginald Ashdown, was a man who gambled with territories he did not own and provoked beasts he could not tame. Now the beasts had come to collect. The heavy oak doors of the hall shattered inward, not opened, but blown off their iron hinges by sheer brute force. The winter wind howled into the room, bringing with it the scent of pine, copper, and apex predator. Enter King Cedric Vane. I was a myth, whispered to frighten children in the southern lands. The Alpha King of the Ironwood Pack. He stood 6'4", a mountain of muscle wrapped in dark leather, furs, and plate armor etched with runic scratches. His hair was the color of midnight, his jaw sharp and dusted with a rough shadow. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Florence's lungs. They were striking, luminous amber. Wolf's eyes, completely devoid of human mercy. Behind him stalked his vanguard, massive men and women who moved with the eerie, silent grace of wolves. The court guards of House Ashdown dropped their spears, their hands shaking so violently the metal clattered against the flagstones. Lord Reginald stepped down from his dais, his face pale, sweating profusely. King Cedric, we did not expect you until the new moon. Your debts do not wait on the moon, Reginald. Cedric's voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and straight into Florence's bones. It wasn't a shout, yet it commanded absolute silence. 50,000 gold pieces, the timber rights to the Whispering Valley, and the blood tithe for the 3 wolves your hunters poached on my borders. I can pay, Reginald stammered, his eyes darting frantically. The gold is coming from the western trade routes. The valley is yours, but the blood tithe, I have no men to spare. Cedric stepped forward, closing the distance in a blink. He grabbed Reginald by the throat, lifting the plump lord entirely off his feet. The Alpha King didn't even look strained. I do not want your men, human. I want payment. Florence's heart slammed against her ribs. She knew her father. She knew his cowardice. As Reginald choked, his frantic gaze searched the room, bypassing his legitimate sons, bypassing his prized knights, until his eyes locked onto the shadows where Florence hid. She was his illegitimate daughter, a secret kept in the dark, useful only as a bargaining chip. "Take her!" Reginald gasped out, pointing a trembling, ring-clad finger toward the pillars. "Take my daughter, Florence." Cedric turned his head. His amber eyes pierced the gloom, locking onto her. The heavy, suffocating aura of an alpha slammed into her, a physical weight that demanded submission. But Florence had spent a lifetime surviving her father's cruelties. She refused to look away. She stepped out of the shadows, lifting her chin, though her hands were clamped tightly together to hide their shaking. Cedric dropped the Lord of Ashdown in a pathetic heap on the floor. He stalked toward Florence. his heavy boots echoing like a death knell. Up close, he was terrifying. A jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow and vanished into his hairline. He smelled of fresh snow and violence. He stopped mere inches from her. He leaned in, his nose brushing the curve of her neck as he inhaled deeply. A low, terrifying growl vibrated in his chest. Florence squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the bite, waiting for him to rip her throat out right there in her father's hall. "She smells of fear," Cedric murmured, his breath hot against her skin. "And betrayal. She will do." Without another word, he turned his back on her. "The debt is settled, Reginald. But if your men step 1 foot into my forests again, I will not come for gold. I will come for your head." Before Florence could even process what was happening, massive hands clamped onto her arms. Cedric's second-in-command, a towering brute named Griffith with a missing ear and a war hammer strapped to his back, hauled her forward. "Walk, little bird," Griffith grunted, not unkindly, but with absolute finality. She was dragged out into the freezing night, thrown into a heavy, iron-reinforced carriage lined with wolf pelts, and the door was slammed shut. As the carriage lurched forward, surrounded by the thundering hooves of the ironwood vanguard, Florence stared out the grated window at her childhood home, fading into the blizzard. She had just been sold to a monster. She was the property of a ruthless alpha who hated humans. She fully expected to be dead before sunrise. The journey to the Ironwood stronghold took 3 grueling days. Florence was given water and drites by a silent guard. But Cedric never once approached the carriage. The dread pooling in her stomach turned into a hard, cold knot. She was going to be a slave, a plaything for a beast, and then discarded. When they finally arrived at the northern capital, Florence was pulled from the carriage into a world of brutal, stark beauty. The castle of Oakhaven was carved directly into the side of a massive, snow-capped mountain. It was a fortress of dark stone, roaring hearths, and banners bearing the dire wolf crest. She was immediately ushered by grim-faced servants into the depths of the keep. They bathed her in water that smelled of cedar and rosemary, scrubbing her skin raw, dressing her in a simple, flowing gown of midnight blue silk. It felt less like a preparation for a royal reception and more like a dressing for a sacrifice. A heavy iron key turned in the lock of her chamber door. Florence stood in the center of the vast room. A massive 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in thick furs. A fire roared in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the tapestries. The silence was deafening. An hour passed, then 2. Just as exhaustion began to drag her down, the heavy oak door swung open. King Cedric stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. The click of the lock echoed like a gunshot. He had stripped off his heavy armor. He wore only dark trousers and a loose linen shirt, the laces undone at the collar, revealing the corded muscle of his chest and a lattice of silver scars. Florence backed away, her spine hitting the cold stone wall. Her breathing grew shallow. This was it. This was the moment he would claim his property. The ruthless Alpha King, a man who broke armies, had bought her for a purpose. Cedric walked slowly toward the center of the room. He didn't look at her with the ravenous hunger of a beast, nor the leering entitlement of a lord. His amber eyes were cold, calculating, and piercingly sharp. He stopped by a heavy oak table, pouring 2 goblets of dark red wine. He held one out without looking at her. "Drink," he commanded. Florence didn't move. Her heart battered against her ribs. "Is it poisoned?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. Cedric let out a low, humorless chuckle. "If I wanted you dead, little bird, you would not have survived the carriage ride. Drink." Slowly, she crept forward, taking the goblet from his massive hand. Their fingers brushed, and a startling jolt of electricity zipped up her arm. Cedric's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing, but he stepped back. He took a long swallow of his wine, watching her over the rim of the cup. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. "I know what you think I am," Cedric finally said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous purr. "I know what your father told you. He filled your head with stories about the wolves of the north, didn't he? He told you we were savages, that we fed on human flesh, that I bought you for a cruel purpose, that I would break your spirit, keep you at my side until I grew tired of you, and then cast you aside like you meant nothing." He paused, his eyes fixed steadily on hers. "But those are his lies, not the truth. You were taught to fear me before you ever had the chance to know me. And perhaps you have every reason to hate me for what you believe I am. But I will not force you to accept my word. I will show you, through my actions, exactly who I am." Florence swallowed hard, staring at the floor. "Are you denying it?" In a flash of movement, so fast she didn't even see him step, Cedric was in front of her. He snatched the goblet from her hand, slamming it onto the table, and grabbed her chin, tilting her face up to meet his furious gaze. "My first command to you, Florence of House Ashdown," he growled, the alpha power rolling off him in suffocating waves, "is this." Florence braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut, preparing for the violation. "Do not kneel to me. Not now. Not ever." Florence's eyes snapped open in pure shock. Cedric released her chin and stepped back, his chest heaving slightly. He reached under the heavy furs of the bed and pulled out a long, leather-wrapped object. He tossed it onto the floor between them. The leather fell away, revealing a stunning, silver-forged broadsword. The hilt was wrapped in dire wolf leather, the blade etched with ancient, glowing runes. "Pick it up," Cedric commanded. Florence stared at him, bewildered. "What?" "I said, pick it up," he roared, the sheer force of his voice rattling the glass in the windows. Trembling, Florence dropped to her knees, forgetting his previous command, and wrapped her fingers around the hilt. It was heavy, perfectly balanced, and humming with a strange, latent power. She stood, holding the blade awkwardly, her muscles straining. "Your father sold you to me to die," Cedric said, his voice dropping back to a dangerous, soft whisper. "He knew he owed a blood tithe. He thought by giving me his bastard daughter, I would kill you in a fit of rage, and his true-born sons would be safe. He discarded you to a monster." Florence's throat tightened. A tear slipped down her cheek, a bitter confirmation of the truth she had always known. Cedric stepped closer, his amber eyes locking onto hers with burning intensity. "I did not buy you to be my whore, Florence. And I did not buy you to be a victim." He reached out, his massive hands wrapping around hers on the hilt of the sword, correcting her grip. His chest pressed against her back, radiating heat. "I bought you," Cedric whispered in her ear, his breath sending shivers down her spine, Because I know the secret your father is hiding. I know what flows in your veins, even if you don't. I bought you so you could learn how to kill him. And tomorrow, your training begins." The next 6 months in the freezing, jagged peaks of Oakhaven did not resemble a captivity. They resembled a forging. Florence woke every morning before the sun broke over the mountain's crest, her muscles screaming in agony. Griffith, the towering, battle-scarred brute, became her shadow and her tormentor. He handed her the silver-forged broadsword until her hands bled and calloused, teaching her how to parry, thrust, and kill. But it was Cedric who taught her how to survive. The ruthless Alpha King, a beast who had supposedly butchered thousands, spent his evenings in the fire-lit courtyard, correcting her stance. He never raised his voice. He never struck her in anger. Instead, he pushed her beyond her human limitations with a terrifying, calculated intensity. "Your father taught you to make yourself small, Florence," Cedric rumbled one evening, pacing around her as she gasped for breath in the snow, the heavy sword trembling in her grip. "He taught you that your survival depended on being invisible. But invisibility is a prey's tactic. Wolves do not hide. We hunt." "I am not a wolf," she screamed, frustration finally boiling over. She swung the heavy blade in a desperate arc, aiming right for his chest. Cedric caught her wrist with effortless speed. His amber eyes flared, not with rage, but with a sudden blazing pride. He pulled her flush against his chest, the cold iron of his armor biting into her soft woolen tunic. "No," he whispered, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending a jolt of fire straight to her core. "You are something much more dangerous." Later that night, Cedric led her deep beneath the keep, down a winding stone staircase that ended in a massive ancient library. The air smelled of dust, old parchment, and secrets. He walked over to a heavy oak table and laid down a crumbling, leather-bound book. "History tells many lies to keep the weak comfortable," Cedric said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "To understand why your father sold you to me, you must look at this." These are the private, hidden journals of William Marshall, the legendary 12th century knight. Humans believe he was merely a great warrior. My kind knows the truth. He was a peacekeeper between the human courts and the lichen territories. Florence traced the cracked leather of the real historical journal. "What does this have to do with me?" "Marshall documented a bloodline," Cedric explained, stepping closer. "A lineage of humans who did not possess the wolf's curse, but carried a different kind of ancient magic. The Merovingian bloodline. They were the first kings of the old world, possessing a dominance so absolute that even an alpha's command would shatter against their will. Their blood can heal a lichen's mortal wound, and their voice can bring a pack to its knees." Cedric reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently lifting her chin. The touch was startlingly tender for a man with so much blood on his hands. "Your mother was not a common tavern whore, as Lord Reginald told you," Cedric said softly. "She was the last known descendant of that bloodline. Your father discovered her lineage and imprisoned her, forcing her to bear you in secret. He knew that if the northern packs ever found out a Merovingian heir existed, we would come for you. He sold you to me thinking I would smell human weakness and kill you, destroying the evidence of his crime and sparing his legitimate sons from my wrath." Florence's mind spun, the revelations crashing over her like a tidal wave. Everything she had ever known, her shame, her illegitimacy, her father's cruelty, was built on a monstrous lie. She wasn't a mistake. She was a weapon he was terrified of. "Why tell me this?" she whispered, staring into his luminous wolf's eyes. "Why train me? Why not just use me, like he did?" Cedric's jaw tightened. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "Because an alpha does not rule by keeping his equals in chains. I felt it the moment you stepped out of the shadows in your father's hall. The command in your blood calling to mine. I did not buy a slave, Florence. I ransomed a queen." The space between them vanished. Cedric kissed her, and it was nothing like the brutal, beastly assault she had once feared. It was acclaiming, fierce, desperate, and intoxicating. The fire that had been slowly building between them over months of grueling training and stolen glances finally ignited. Florence dropped the ancient journal and wrapped her hands in his dark hair, kissing the Alpha King back with a ferocity that matched his own. But their sanctuary was shattered by the frantic ringing of the iron war bells. The heavy oak doors of the library slammed open, and Griffith stood there, his face covered in soot and fresh blood, his war hammer already drawn. "My king," Griffith panted, his eyes darting to Florence before locking on to Cedric. "Treason! A spy opened the southern gates. Lord Reginald has not come alone. He has allied with Kaelin of the Blood Moon Pack. They are marching through the lower valley. They have come to burn Oakhaven to the ground." The northern winds shrieked like a dying animal as the Blood Moon Pack, flanked by the heavily armored human soldiers of House Ashdown, breached the lower courtyards of Oakhaven. From the battlements, Florence watched the sea of torches painting the snow in horrific shades of crimson and gold. The sheer numbers were staggering. Lord Reginald had sold out his own kind, allying with a rogue, bloodthirsty alpha, just to erase the mistake he had made in giving Florence to the Ironwood Pack. Cedric stood beside her, clad in full battle armor, a massive broadsword resting casually on his shoulder. He looked down at the invading army, his amber eyes completely devoid of warmth. The beast was fully awake now. "Kaelin wants my territory," Cedric rumbled, his voice carrying the terrifying resonance of a shifting lichen. "And your father wants your head on a pike. Stay in the keep, Florence. Griffith will guard you." No, the word left her lips before she could even think about it. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Florence turned to face him, the silver-forged blade strapped to her waist, her dark blue cloak whipping in the blizzard. "He is my father. He is my monster to slay," she said, her voice eerily calm. She felt something ancient and heavy rising in her chest, a power she didn't fully understand, but suddenly knew how to wield, the Merovingian blood. Cedric stared at her for a long, breathless moment. Then a dark, feral grin spread across his face. "Then we hunt together, little bird." The gates of the upper keep were thrown open, and the Ironwood Pack poured out like a black avalanche. The clash of steel and the deafening roars of transforming wolves echoed off the jagged mountains. It was a massacre of fur, fang, and iron. Florence moved through the chaos not with the frantic panic of a frightened girl, but with the lethal, fluid grace Cedric had beaten into her. She parried a thrust from an Ashdown soldier, spinning and driving the pommel of her sword into his temple, leaving him unconscious in the snow. She didn't want to kill the human men. They were merely pawns to her father's cowardice. A massive, rust-colored wolf lunged at her from the blind side. Before it could snap its jaws around her throat, a blur of black fur and iron slammed into it. Cedric, fully shifted into a monstrous, midnight black dire wolf, tore the rogue's throat out in a spray of crimson, turning his terrifying, glowing eyes back to Florence to ensure she was safe. "Florence!" The shrill, panicked voice cut through the din of battle. She turned. There, standing on a raised stone dais in the courtyard, surrounded by his elite guard, was Lord Reginald. He looked older, frantic, his pristine armor splattered with the mud and blood of a war he was rapidly losing. "Kill her!" Reginald shrieked, pointing a trembling sword at his daughter. "Kill the bastard bitch before she ruins us all!" 5 of his heavily armored knights drew their broadswords and charged at her. Florence didn't raise her sword. She didn't fall back into a defensive stance. She remembered Cedric's first command to her: "Do not kneel." She took a deep breath, reaching into the deepest, darkest well of her ancient bloodline. When she opened her mouth, the voice that echoed across the courtyard did not belong to a 19-year-old girl. It was layered, echoing with the crushing weight of 1,000 ancient kings. "Kneel." The word hit the courtyard like a physical shockwave. The 5 charging knights froze mid-stride, their eyes widening in sudden, uncontrollable terror. Their knees buckled, armor clattering loudly against the frozen stone as they dropped to the ground, entirely paralyzed by the absolute dominance of the Merovingian command. Across the battlefield, the fighting faltered. Even the rogue Blood Moon wolves whined, their ears pinning back as an instinctual urge to submit washed over them. Florence walked slowly up the stone steps toward her father. Lord Reginald was backing away, his sword shaking violently in his grip, his face completely drained of color. "You," Reginald gasped, stumbling over a dead body and falling backward onto the cold stone. "You are an abomination." "I am exactly what you made me, father," Florence said coldly, stopping at the edge of his boots. She drew her silver blade, the runes glowing faintly in the firelight. "You sold me to a monster, hoping he would break me. But you forgot one crucial thing." She raised the blade. "You forgot to tell the monster that I was born to be a queen." She brought the heavy hilt of the sword down directly into Reginald's temple. The cowardly lord of Ashdown crumpled into the snow, unconscious and defeated. She would not kill him. Death was too easy. He would rot in the dungeons of Oakhaven, watching the daughter he threw away rule the north. A heavy silence fell over the courtyard. The Blood Moon Alpha, Kalen, lay dead at the center of the battlefield, his neck snapped by the Alpha King. The remaining rogue wolves and Ashdown soldiers dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in absolute surrender. Cedric, covered in the blood of his enemies, shifted back into his human form. He walked up the steps of the dais, his broad chest heaving, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and snow. He looked down at Lord Reginald's pathetic form, and then up at Florence. She stood tall, the bloody sword at her side, her eyes blazing with an unyielding, ancient power. For the first time in his long, violent life, the ruthless Alpha King of the Ironwood Pack did something no one ever thought possible. Cedric Vane dropped to one knee, bowing his head to the human girl he had bought at an auction. "My queen," he murmured, his voice thick with raw emotion and absolute devotion. Behind him, the towering Griffith dropped to his knees. Then the vanguard. Then the entire Ironwood Pack, hundreds of wolves bowing in perfect unison to Florence. She reached down, her trembling fingers tangling in Cedric's dark hair, and gently pulled him back to his feet. She didn't want him on his knees. She wanted him by her side, as the winter sun broke over the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting brilliant rays of gold across the blood-soaked snow. Florence pressed her lips to Cedric's. She was no longer a pawn, no longer a secret, and no longer a slave. She was the Queen of the North, and alongside her ruthless Alpha King, they would forge a new era. One where neither human nor wolf would ever have to hide in the shadows again. Did Florence's brutal transformation and her undeniable chemistry with the ruthless Alpha King leave you craving more? The world of the Ironwood Pack is just getting started, and there are countless more secrets, betrayals, and fierce romances waiting in the shadows. If you loved this intense werewolf drama, make sure to like this video, share it with your fellow fantasy romance addicts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another epic, heart-pounding story. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you discovered a secret, ancient power in your bloodline?